wonderful to welcome Dr. Ramachandra Guha to Chandigarh, and if there is a list in our country about celebrated intellectuals, public intellectuals actually, we don't have a category like that in India, but if we did, Dr. Guha would be on top of that list. And the reason I say this is because he likes to speak about things that a lot of people don't do or cannot do in the times that we live in. Just like the newspaper that I work in, the Tribune, we like to make it our business to say uncomfortable things, and Dr. Guha is part of the same, shall I say, genre. Sumita Mishra works for the Haryana government, and you talked about the celebrated environmentalists in Dr. Guha's book. But I'm just wondering why Haryana would not follow the lead that Dr. Guha has given. I mean, the kind of destruction of the Aravallis, for example, in Haryana. And I hope that, Sumita, you will personally look into this now that you're the Home Secretary. But this evening is not about Sumita, nor is it about me, it's about Ram Guha. And I'd especially like to welcome you to the city of Chandigarh, a city full of trees. There is a leisure valley just opposite this space, Dr. Guha, which Corbusier, when he built this city, said that man, besides the physical sort of sustenance that he needs, also needs to sort of walk in the parks. So, and your first comments about coming to Chandigarh.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you to the Chandigarh Literary Society for inviting me. It's really nice to be in conversation with Jyoti Malhotra, whom I've known and admired for a very long time. This is actually only my second visit to Chandigarh. The first was when I was 11 or 12. And, so I have really no memories about that except playing cricket in a park with my cousins. But Chandigarh I associate with two people. One whom I never met, and the second was a mentor of mine. The first whom I had never met, and would have been known surely to people in this room, was a certain Lieutenant General Baljit Singh, whom I used to read in the pages of a little magazine I subscribed to in Dehradun in the 60s and 70s called Newsletters for Bird Watchers. And he was a regular contributor to that, so he would have been writing about the bird life of the Aravallis. My second connection to Chandigarh, which is more meaningful to me, was that my revered teacher, Gurdial Singh, retired here. And Jyoti, there's a lesson that Gurdial Singh, who was in many ways the father of Indian mountaineering, a great pioneering mountaineer, a teacher who inspired, among others, Vikram Seth in his years in the Doon School, taught me a lesson when I was in my first term in the school. Now, as some of you know, I'm crazy about cricket, and I have been from when I was a little boy. And when I was 11, I was playing a house match for the juniors team, and Gurdial Singh was umpiring, and I was bowling, and the non-striker had taken a couple of steps outside the crease, and I had read, I knew the rules. So I whipped off the bails and I said, "How's that?" And Gurdial said, Gurdial could never pronounce my name. My full name is Ramachandra, but he only called me Ramchandar as a good Sardar. So he said, "Not out, Ramchandar, very bad sportsmanship." Now, that's the difference between the spirit and the letter. Honor not just the letter but the spirit, because the letter allows you to run out someone who's taken a step, but the spirit says give him a warning. Yeah. Right. So I was thinking of Gurdial, and he settled here, we were in touch till the end. I'm sure some of you knew him. He was a very extraordinary man, And when I got an award, one of the few awards I don't mention because it's a government award. And luckily it was not in the list mentioned that. But Gurdial was happy. And he sent me a card which was of Mount Kamet. And he sent me the card and said, "Well done, dear boy," and I was so proud to have been a teacher. I did a headstand on that mountain 7 years before you were born.
Wow.
So that's my connection to the city of Chandigarh. I am really happy to be here on my first proper trip, I'm ashamed to say. And hopefully the spirit of my beloved Guru, he was called Guru because he was all our Gurus. He was very, he came from a celebrated military family. I don't want to make this too much about Gurdial, but he always called himself the black sheep of the family because he didn't join the army and he also cut off his beard. But anyway, for me, Chandigarh is not so much Corbusier as it is the place where Gurdial spent his last 4 decades. So I'm very happy to be here.
So my first question to you is about this book, Speaking with Nature. You've written a lot about Gandhi. Of course, environment is one of your early loves, but tell us, why did you write this book?
So I wrote this book, I started on this book 4 decades ago. As was mentioned, my PhD was in the social history of peasants in Uttarakhand and the Chipko movement. And after I finished my PhD, I spent a year as a postdoc in America. And in a library in America, I discovered the writings of 2 remarkable Indians. And this often happens, that American libraries is where you discover stuff that is actually originally published in India and which Indian libraries have not archived properly. The writings of a Gandhian economist called J.C. Kumarappa, who talked really about decentralized grassroots development, management of common property resources, water conservation, integrating, critiques of chemical fertilizers and warnings that chemical agriculture would destroy the environment in the 30s and 40s. And so him and a scholar called Radhakamal Mukherjee, who was a sociologist who taught in Lucknow University for many decades, and which is why Dr. Mishra is shaking her head, and who advocated a kind of integrated approach to understanding human beings in nature, where you would draw on the insights of natural sciences and social sciences. So I read their works, and I thought there is an interesting intellectual prehistory to contemporary environmentalism. I'm living in the age of Chipko, Narmada, the Kerala fisherfolk struggle, but in the 30s and 40s, some intellectuals were warning us against the destructive path of industrialization we finally adopted. And I started probing further, and I came up with half a dozen names, and I thought I should write a book on them, a kind of a complement to what I had already done. And then I got distracted. I got distracted by work on Indian history and then on Gandhi, and I took a long detour. I mean, long means even in terms of time, a 2-decade detour. And then during the pandemic, when all of us were marooned at home, I returned to the notes I had taken in the 80s and 90s on these pioneering thinkers, and I realized that I'd done a fair amount of work, and if I just, after the pandemic ended, did a few months more work, I could probably write a useful book. So in a sense, this started as a pre-Chipko history, and it became eventually, because of when I finished it, a pre-climate change history as well. And then I stumbled upon these 10 people. On each of them, there was interesting, unusual, rich material available to flesh out their ideas and show, I hope, with some credibility that they were indeed early environmentalists. But so it's kind of a return after many decades to the first area of my research.
Now you talked about the Gandhians in this book, and there are a few, right? There's Kumarappa, there's Madeleine or Meera, Verrier Elwin too, perhaps.
Yeah.
But there's K. Munshi, who you call the first Hindutva environmentalist.
Yeah.
First of all, why do you say that? And what's Rabindranath Tagore got to do with K. Munshi, although both of them, in a sense, K. Munshi talks about the Ban Mahotsav, and so does Tagore in his own way. But apart from that very tenuous link, what does one man have to do with the other?
So what the link is that they, in different ways, they talked about human attitudes towards nature in a serious, rigorous way, but with different inflections. And environmentalism is, it's a large, capacious tent. And if you try and look at the relationship of environmentalism with political philosophies, you can find a conservative environmentalism, you can find a liberal environmentalism, you can find a radical environmentalism, and you can even find a feminist environmentalism, right? So I wanted to show all the colors of the environmental rainbow. And what is interesting about Munshi and Tagore is that they were both celebrated in fields other than environmentalism. So Tagore is known as a poet, a playwright, an institution builder, someone who inspired Gandhi, Nehru and Tagore, who was the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize in any language, as someone who became a pioneering artist in his 70s, but his environmental thought had been ignored or underplayed. Munshi's environmental, again Munshi is actually a considerable figure, however one looks at his politics. Here is a man who is Bombay's foremost lawyer, Gujarat's best-selling novelist, a key architect of the Indian Constitution, someone who is, so and then there is this other side to him where unlike Tagore is a kind of environmentalist from his childhood. He's writing about the trees, he sees his first trip, I quote in his book, an early trip he took to Dalhousie, which is now in Himachal, right? And how the landscape, the rivers, the trees. So Tagore is kind of an environmentalist from very early on, then he integrates it in his education in Shanti Niketan, then he integrates it in his politics. In my view, Tagore is the first thinker to show that Western imperialism was not just a system of political and economic domination, but also ecological exploitation of Asia and Africa. So Tagore, I argue, is a lifelong environmentalist with many facets to his environmentalism. Munshi is an opportunistic environmentalism. So he's a Gujarati novelist with a particularly, dark view of Muslim rulers and maybe an excessively benign view of Hindu rulers. He's a great constitutionalist, a famous and lawyer with a hugely lucrative practice. And then he becomes minister in the Nehru government in 1950. And it's kind of a concession to Patel because he was close to Patel. And Munshi would have thought someone like Munshi would either become education minister or maybe law minister. But Maulana Azad was education minister, Ambedkar was, law minister. So he's assigned this Ministry of Forests and Agriculture and Food and Agriculture, of which forest is one of the domains. And he decides now to marry his religion with his environmentalism and start Vana Mahotsava and talk about, excessively romantic way about how our scriptures were all about protecting forests and Krishna was born in a grove and that's why you need to do. And he uses a very casteist language, which I talk about. He's telling merchants, contribute to my fund because I'm a Brahmin and you have to listen to what Brahmins. So it's a very interesting case of a right-wing environmentalism, but very passionately and compellingly argued because he was a great writer. So, and it gives the book a kind of a more rounded approach. Rather, you see, it's often interesting. Not interesting, it's often salutary and necessary for a historian to write about people with whose views he does not necessarily agree, and to write about them with some empathy and understanding, not simply debunk them, to reconstruct their views. So I thought that's why I must include Munshi as well.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about this chapter which you call Dissenting Scientists. Now, Albert and Gabriel Howard, and the strap says Albert and Gabriel Howard and the quest for an ecological architecture. Now, this is again a couple who come to India, but actually the reason I was struck by Albert Howard is because he comes to India, he travels across then undivided India, of course, and then he writes about the farmers of Punjab. And Ram, we are in the middle of this sort of crisis which doesn't seem to be ending. The farmers' protest that has gone on and on and on for so many months now. And even today we're arguing about whether the farmer leaders have, sort of broken their fast or not. But whatever that is and whatever that story is about. But this paragraph is so moving in a way, and if you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of lines. As he himself wrote of the farmers of Punjab, many terms are used to describe the physical character of the soils. Thus, Niai's rich land around the homestead. Heavy clay soils are termed dakar, chamb, and the heaviest clays on which rice only can be grown are termed rakar. The best soils of the Punjab are well-drained loams known as rohi. The lighter loams are called rosli, and the sandy soils which grow only millets are known as bhur or maira. Tibba is almost pure sand, and Reti is a soil with wind-blown hillocks of sand. Now, I'm not sure if anybody here in the audience even recognizes any of those words. Do any of you recognize those words? Do you, Sumita? It's so, it's, I think, the older people, but perhaps, I don't know if we've lost that vocabulary, but why Gabriel and Albert Howard?
So, because two reasons. One is, two or several reasons. One is, I've always had a fascination with dissenting foreigners. I wrote a biography of Very Relevant, who figures again in this book. I wrote a book called Rebels Against the Raj, which is about foreigners who joined the freedom struggle. And that book is dedicated to Jean Drèze, who understands the Indian economy better than any Kalu, any of us Kalus, who's a Belgian who settled in India. And I always, because I'm very resistant to black and white portraits of colonialism, the British were always bad, and now we of course told the Mughals are only bad. So I've always been interested in dissenting, people who went against the grain. And here, and they went against the grain in several respects. One was that they were against narrow specialization. So they worked in the Colonial Agricultural Research Service, and they found it was so specialized. Somebody looked at the roots, somebody looked at the stalk, somebody looked at the flower, and they said you have to have an integrated approach, and you have to look at all parts of the plant, and you have to look at soil and water and climate. And I think that's what they were, in a sense, they had an ecological approach. And they also recognized early on the limits of chemicalized agriculture, much more systematic than Kumarappa, because they were scientists. And of course, we needed the Green Revolution. I'll start with that. I say the Green Revolution saved India, not just economically, but politically, because if those hybrid seeds had not been designed, if the farmers of areas like Punjab, Western Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and a few selected areas had not been given the mandate to radically increase their productivity. I remember this, some of you would remember, I grew up in the 60s, so I remember the scarcity and the famine. And the Green Revolution safeguarded our food security, but also our political independence, because we were to become clients of America, right? So, but at some stage, we had to go beyond that. And some visionary scientists today, such as the late M.S. Swaminathan, who was an architect of the Green Revolution, but then recognized that he had to adopt, or his team had to adopt a much more ecological approach, which is why he talked about bio-villages. So the Howards are anticipating this understanding. They are also pioneering a method of composting that is used across the world, but very little in India. And finally, because it's an interesting case study of a man and a woman married, devoted to the research, where the man gets an excessive share of the credit. Now, this is a kind of common thing in many fields, where it's often easier when a couple both are working, but one is in a different field, right? Say if there's a lawyer and a bureaucrat, or an artist and a scientist. But so I realized that actually all the writings I was reading were only about Albert, and there was a passing reference to Gabriel. But Gabriel actually had a much more profoundly ecological approach, and she did field work in Baluchistan in the 1910s. I mean, just think of a solitary woman doing field work there. So that's kind of the kind of reason I wanted to include them. And one of the interesting things about this book, Jyoti, is that there are 10 people, right? Now, people in this room, including Professor Vatas, would know, so the really good architects and urban conservationists know about Patrick Geddes. So my chapter on Patrick Geddes for a specialist gives them maybe 10% or 20% more than they know. But then others they don't know about. But someone who's worked in, shall we say, only in forests, has no clue about Patrick Geddes. So the interesting thing about the reaction to this book is different. Like you say, why the Howards? Somebody says, hey, but Geddes was surprising, right? So I think what I'm trying to show is that the range of people who worked in different domains. They worked in the wilderness, the forest, the farm, the village. They worked on water. They worked on energy. They worked on transport. They worked in cities. And in a sense, though, there's one last thing I'll say, though I insist, as a historian, my job is to document and analyze, not to prescribe. A historian is not a policy maker. And that is, a historian cannot advise governments, and a historian can't even advise activists directly. But activists and policy makers can glean their own lessons from this book.
Which brings us to Geddes. Which brings us to Patrick Geddes. Now, you said you like men who go against the grain, and he's one of them. an ecological environmentalist. Now you know, Gandhi, your favorite person, is sort of known to say that India lives in its villages. But does India live in her villages? And Patrick Geddes is expanding that argument.
Absolutely. And this goes back to again my early work. So if those of us who remember the 80s and the 90s, I mean the two iconic environmental movements, grassroots environmental movements that married sustainability with social justice were Chipko and Narmada. They were both in the countryside. If we look at slightly lesser known movements, which are known maybe not as visible or well known as Chipko and Narmada, the Kerala fisher folk struggle, the anti-mining movements in Orissa, the Save the Western Ghats movement, they all are again away from the cities. And you could say that Indian environmentalists took some clues from Gandhi that were helpful and that were some unhelpful, that the activists of the 80s and 90s turned their back on the city just as Gandhi did. Now it's interesting that Gandhi was shaped by the city. Without London, without Bombay, without Ahmedabad, without Johannesburg, there would be no Gandhi. So I felt that given that India is now becoming more and more of an urban civilization, you know, Gandhi said India lives in her villages, but India has always lived in her cities too, and now of course it lives more and more in her cities and towns, which is where Geddes' ideas about how to make the cities habitable, socially and environmentally, become so strikingly prescient.
And that brings me to Gandhi's Englishwoman and the passionate environmentalist of Madeleine Slade. She is everywhere in your books. You're particularly fond of her.
I'm fond of her, and many years ago, I can tell this story. Many years ago, I wrote a column about her, maybe 20 odd years ago, before I had written even on Gandhi or anything else. And I said, she really deserves a biography on her own, you know. An admiral's daughter who leaves it all, comes to live with Gandhi, works with him, then leaves Gandhi, falls in love, is rejected, then starts an ashram in the Himalaya, then leaves the Himalaya, spends 10 years there, then goes to Vienna. So I wrote, and I said there, and this might amuse you, Jyoti, I said, I know the person who should try and write this book, and I will try and persuade her. I ended my column in the Hindu with these words more than 20 years ago, and that person was someone I'm sure you know, Rajni Bakshi, who had just written a lovely book called Bapu Kuti. And I was unsuccessful in persuading her to take up that book. I think sent her a message. Send her a message to write. So but she is absolutely fascinating because there's so many aspects to her, and her environmentalism is one of them. I mean, other things that are not here, but which I've written about elsewhere. Because she was, you know, Gandhi was a very carry man. So because she was so upper class, you know, she's an admiral's daughter who joins Gandhi. In 1934, after the Round Table Conference had failed, Gandhi sent her to lobby for Indian freedom, an English woman wearing khadi, representing Gandhi, because given whose daughter she was, Churchill gave her an audience. She talked to Eleanor, she stayed with Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House. Now, so she's an absolutely fascinating figure. In this book, I only talk about one aspect of her work. But, you know, I hope someone one day writes a full book on her. Maybe there should be a film about her. You know, she's an incredibly interesting person. Yeah.
So, you know, Ram, you do the cunning thing. You don't write overtly about politics, but actually every sentence is imbued with not just the politics of the time, of the person that you write about, but also of today, isn't it? Whether it's Madeleine and you're talking about her politics and the politics of the time, of Gandhi, of the Raj, and then what that means to India.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously, this is a book that is subtly sending a political message, but the main... Which is what? No, but but that's not the core of the book. Okay. That's not the core of the book. The core of the book is as follows. That the core argument of the book, if there's an argument of the book, is as follows: India faces a colossal environmental crisis that is independent of climate change. So air pollution across northern India has nothing to do with climate change. The depletion of groundwater aquifers, not least in Punjab, has nothing to do with climate change. The loss of biodiversity has nothing to do with climate change. And all of these, the death of our rivers, has nothing to do with climate change. Climate change makes it worse. But all these problems raise a huge question mark about the sustainability of our economic model. And no government, whether BJP or Congress or DMK or TMC or whatever, or Aam Aadmi Party or whatever have you, they just sidestep it because they don't find it electorally profitable, but it will come, it will devour India. It will, and that's why you have to start thinking very seriously about forging a model of environmentally sustainable social and economic development, and we do have the intellectual resources to forge that model both in the past and in the present. If you look at the scientific expertise we have in most of our research institutes today, who are never consulted by governments, urban planners, agronomists, soil scientists are virtually never consulted by government. So that is the core of the book. There is obviously, it is at one level, so, but you're right, I mean, obviously my broader philosophy or political philosophy, which is inclusive, which values democracy, which values pluralism, which is not xenophobic. I mean, I detest those who detest everything foreign, because the greatness of it, the greatest Indians, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Tagore, all drew from their travels across the world, right? And this kind of xenophobic nationalism that is rampant today, I think is destructive to us, even in an intellectual sense, which is why out of the 10 figures in this book, 5 were born overseas. So, but that is, those messages are, you could say, indirect. The core is an argument about taking the environmental challenges to be faced.
But how is this going to devour India?
I mean, because you will find, I mean, like Bangalore where I live will become uninhabitable because we won't have water. I mean, the Punjab farmers are facing the crisis that excessive chemicalized agriculture has done to it. I mean, it is air pollution across our northern cities debilitates young people, their health, the livelihoods of their parents. So it is it's exacting a huge economic, health, livelihood cost already, and is simply not sustainable. I mean, and I don't believe that there's a technological quick fix, that will solve it. The only technological quick fix that will solve it, as one geneticist kind of facetiously told me, is that we now have the capacity to engineer human beings who do not grow more than 2 feet, but have the brilliance of the most brilliant scientists. So we can still dominate the rest of creation, but our cars are so big and our houses are that big because materially we cannot sustain the globalization of American standards of consumption, and that's what India and China is trying to do. That's why my epigraph is from Gandhi, where he says, if India continues like this, it will strip the world bare like locusts, and that's what India and China are doing. So that's what I believe, that it is an existential crisis. It may come to hit us in 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, but it will come finally.
But how relevant is what Gandhi says to India today? We are in 2025. The man died in... Even he realized he was irrelevant already in 1948.
But he could see, I think his broader environmental philosophy is relevant. He doesn't have actionable ideas for us to implement, but the idea that there are biophysical limits to economic growth, that economic growth based on heavy resource extraction cannot continue for more than, shall we say, a few more generations. I think I'm convinced that that aspect, that we have to remodel, rethink what we mean by growth.
Now, the other thing about these men and women that you've picked, Verrier Elwin, for example, the reason, I like Verrier Elwin is because he also tells Nehru that his policies and his plans vis-a-vis India's tribal population just don't work. Now, he had the courage to tell India's Prime Minister that, he's sort of the blue-eyed boy of the country. But he tells him off.
Yeah, of course. And most of these are, they are, I do not like the cliche phrase, speaking truth to power. But they're speaking the truth. And again, that is a Gandhian legacy. That's also a Gandhian legacy. They speak the truth, however uncomfortable it is. Tell the Hindus that their treatment of women and Dalits is despicable. Even if the Hindus don't want to hear it. Tell the Hindus later on that if you want to build a country that is safe and prosperous, you have to live harmoniously and peaceably with your fellow Muslims, even though the Hindus don't want to hear it in 47. So that says all of these people are clear about what, based on not based on opinion, based on rigorous research, based on years of living with people or studying, a particular set of natural phenomena. They have that intellectual rigor and intellectual honesty, and even if that costs them, positions, if it costs them popularity, so be it.
So very relevant. Tell us a little bit more about him.
So, I mean, again, Elwin is the one, actually Elwin is the person who means, in some ways of this book means most to me, because he changed my whole life. I mean, I don't say this here, but I was an English, I have friends here in the audience who will recall that when I was a student at St. Stephen's College, I was utterly mediocre at economics, which is what I was registered to do. And while I was doing my master's in economics, I read Elwin, his autobiography, which is a gorgeously written book, which also won the Sahitya Academy Award. And I decided, sociology, anthropology, history is where maybe it's more congenial to me. And then I went to Calcutta and did a PhD in sociology and then moved to history. So, and then when I worked on forests, there was Elwin. And when I looked at dissenting foreigners who came to India, there was Elwin. And Elwin wrote beautifully too. So as a writer, I admire someone who wrote such gorgeous prose. And in this book, of course, I wanted someone, so this book is about people in the cities, people and environments in the cities, in the villages, which are mostly Hindu caste villages. And Elwin, in a sense, represented the Adivasis of both central India and the northeast. And that crucial group of Indians, I thought were important to represent in this book through someone who had studied their life, their culture, their relationship to the forest so thoroughly over so long, and hence Elwin.